All right, kids, Juneteenth is coming up. If you don't know what it is or remember what I told you about it, check out the What to a Black Person is Your Independence Day video I made about it last year. This month, Black people all around the country will be celebrating Juneteenth. I'm sure some will do so instead of Independence Day, inviting people to the cookout while learning more about Juneteenth themselves and educating others along the way. Although Juneteenth is not a federal holiday yet, it is recognized in most states in America. With this uptick in recognition for Blackness, even though Juneteenth should be celebrated by all because it meant all were finally free-ish, there will inevitably be an all lives mattering of the movement. Here's a reason why and what we're going to talk about today. In 1654, it was time for a man, as I'll temporarily refer to him, to release John Kacer, a Black indentured servant. Instead, the man told Kacer he was extending his time. Kacer left and became employed by a white man by the name of Robert Parker. The man sued Robert Parker in the Northampton court in 1654. And in 1655, the court ruled that the man could hold Kacer indefinitely the rest of his life. The court gave judicial sanction for this man to own a Black slave. The man's name was Anthony Johnson, and he himself was a Black man. At least that's what this infographic says. Now, a number of people will take the fact that Anthony Johnson owned Black people as confirmation that U.S. chattel slavery couldn't have been about race. You should know that Anthony Johnson was once a slave or indentured servant himself. And there's a great distinction between the two, which we'll go over in detail later. But during their time, it's hard to tell because definitions for each status weren't as well defined as they are now. Well, a year after Anthony Johnson, who was born Antonio and anglicized his name to Anthony, was taken to Jamestown, Virginia in 1621, the homestead of the Bennett family where he worked alongside white immigrants was attacked by the Powhatan tribe and Johnson survived. Somehow, some way. And Anthony later gained his freedom, got married, had kids, and owned land. Anyhow, a former slave who owned slaves? This is the worst get you somebody who can do both in the history of all things. And yes, later, Anthony Johnson argued that John Kacer was a slave and not an indentured servant, as Kacer claimed. When it comes to the court ruling about Kacer, people conveniently skim over the African man being wrongfully sentenced to be a slave for the rest of his life, just because Anthony Johnson fits the narrative they want to be true. So, was Anthony Johnson the first slave owner in this country? Also, if U.S. chattel slavery was not about race, as in white superiority over Black people specifically, my question is, why weren't poor white people enslaved by either white people or Black people? Before I answer these two questions, look, there's this rumor or theory or idea that the Irish were enslaved on this land, which would come to be known as the United States. But where are people getting this information? Yes, there are books, but Facebook posts, memes, and infographics like the one I read earlier. For instance, this article, where are the primary sources? And who is John Martin? And what else did he write? Also, this thing. One quick image search will show you that this picture, in fact, isn't of slave little girls, but oyster shuckers in South Carolina circa 1911. And of course, this picture of Anthony Johnson isn't of him either. As for the distinction between indentured servants, for which the Irish were, the vast majority of them went to Barbados in the West Indies and not the American colonies, which is also actually the case for most of the enslaved Black people from Africa, with Brazil being a larger destination as well. What the industry of slavery came to be meant that Black U.S. chattel enslaved people were overwhelmingly owned as private property. They were purchased and could never buy or earn their freedom. They would die as slaves. The children born to enslaved women were slaves, meaning they would belong to someone else from birth to death. Indentured servitude, on the other hand, was mutually agreed upon by the laborer and master. Most came to the West willingly, while some were subjected involuntarily due to being prisoners and vagabonds. The servant would be obligated to work a predetermined amount of time, typically 4 to 7 years. At the end of the term, servants could earn their freedom, money, clothing, livestock, land. The practice of indentured servitude declined in the second half of the 17th century as colonists made the full transition to African slave labor, which was cheaper and increased consistent production. This isn't to say that indentured servants had it easy. They suffered unspeakable acts too. Some were killed before their contracts were up. They were beaten, abused, and taken advantage of as well. Matthew Riley, an archaeologist who has studied white communities in the Caribbean, said this about Irish indentured servants. During their period of servitude, their treatment varied widely. Some suffered extreme violence and brutality, especially the Irish in the Caribbean, but many had avenues to pursue legal action against their masters, something never extended to the enslaved. You know, while I'm attacking misinformation and being misled and falsehoods, I want to encourage you, kids, and those who may be watching this, to look up a number of things yourselves. Like this fact checker and a primary source for today, Irish librarian and historian Liam Hogan. We've talked about the one-drop rule before, but then there's also partis sequitur venturum and an act concerning servants and slaves. Don't forget about the Dred Scott decision. Which brings us to our answers. Black people did not have legal rights. They couldn't legally own white people in the U.S., nor by right or custom. When the ship Desire brought a cargo of Africans from Barbados to Boston in 1634, in 1640, John Punch, a runaway servant of African descent, was sentenced to lifelong slavery in Virginia, while the two European-born companions who fled with him had their indentures extended by 1 year. What happened to John Punch occurred before what happened to John Kaser. So that answers our first question. Anthony Johnson wasn't the first slave owner in the U.S. He was one of the first, though. Besides, if indentured servitude for the Irish was what people say it was, then where are the vestiges from that industry? Landmarks, historical sites, where is the physical representation and enduring legacy from that time period? Was there a date, a law, or event which led to their enslavement ending? I mean, look at Rhode Island. The name of that state is actually Colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, and we know why. Oh, and never mind the fact that the Irish were slave owners in America or involved and benefited from the dispossession of indigenous people's lands across multiple continents. With black people being treated like cattle, it would still be better to be poor and white than to be black at all. This was an era when a black person, an N-word, and a slave were interchangeable terms. Something that needs to be said is that black men who enslaved black people were not deemed as equals to their white counterparts. Proving that point is another famous or infamous black enslaver, William Ellison. So why would a black person enslave another black person? Money. Even if Anthony Johnson was the first slave owner in America, he isn't. He wasn't the last black one either. It doesn't take away the racially based system of hereditary slavery that harmed the vast majority of black people living within it. By the way, according to Henry Louis Gates, after Johnson's death, a court ruled he was a Negro and by consequence an alien. Subsequently, the colony of Virginia seized his family's land and his descendants faded from the historical record. So there's that. Before I head to the cookout, I personally hear the black people owned slaves or Africans sold black people into slavery or the Irish were slaves and you don't hear us/them complaining stuffs. When reparations for U.S. chattel slavery comes up and when Black Lives Matter is frequently said, these things are going to build with the 1619 Project and critical race theory and Juneteenth. So when an All Lives Matter says if we pay black people reparations for slavery, then everybody in the world should be owed money because every race was enslaved at some point, tell them no. We're talking about what happened in this land, in this time, in this country. They ain't invited to the cookout. So we're going to be all right.